Hello and welcome to Teaching Listening by UNI-Prep. My name is Jonathan, and I'm excited about this lesson because even though listening is a really difficult skill to teach your students, it's also really rewarding, and I think I've put together a pretty good lesson plan example that you can use in your classroom to make sure the listening lessons are engaging and exciting for your students. Even though listening is really difficult to teach, it's essential because out in the real world, we interact with each other with listening. Reading and writing, while those are really important for academic and professional settings, for actual communication, listening is one of the most important ones. So let's talk about why we should teach listening. And I think the most important thing is that 90% of the information that we give our students in class is through listening. Now think about this. There's your board, and the visual aspect of your board is essential to keeping a good class. However, everything that you write on that board, you have probably said or your students have said. And you have all this little interaction that you're going to be doing throughout the classroom, whether it's asking just, how are you doing? What do you have for breakfast? Can you please answer the door? Having a student ask if they can go to the bathroom, and then you have to have a response. This is all related to listening. All these little things that we don't think about are related to listening. Now, as a native speaker, listening is a very passive activity. I can be sitting, laying down, and listening to what other people are saying without hardly any effort on my part. However, it's not so. Non native speakers are going to take a lot of energy and then have to expend all that energy thinking exactly what you are saying while you're talking. I know this just from learning the Spanish language that when I first started out, listening was a hugely difficult and taxing activity, especially if it wasn't a completely quiet environment or the speaker was speaking really quickly. It's really difficult and it takes a long time to develop a good listening ability. This skill does not come easily. It's only after lots and lots of repetition that it will develop. So you have to be that leader in that development. You have to make sure you are constantly teaching that listening. It's not always the most exciting thing, and a lot of times your students will have some opposition to it because it's really difficult. But just remember that you're doing them a favor by making sure they develop their listening ability. So let's look at some facts about listening. So of the four skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking, listening is the most difficult. Listening and speaking are the more difficult ones because there is less time that a student can spend thinking and planning what they are going to say or how they can absorb the information. Listening, a student only has one chance to figure out what's going on, and they have no control over what's happening, right? Because if you're speaking, you have all this control over what you want to say. Let's say you don't remember the word for something, you can use the rest of your vocabulary to kind of build a bridge around that word. But if you are listening and if someone says that word and you don't know it, it's already gone and he's moved on to the next thing he's talking about. So listening is very difficult because you have a lack of control. Now, these are some things that make it hard, and if you have ever learned a foreign language, you will totally understand what I'm talking about. So, not being able to see the speaker is a big issue. This is a problem if you're doing a podcast or listening exercise where you don't have video, because usually the student is able to see the person speaking and is able to help read the lips, gestures, and expressions are all going to inform the student about what's going on. Background noise is a huge problem, especially if the students are older and they're at a bar or a loud restaurant and you're trying to hear someone, it's really difficult. More than one person is another problem. A lot of times in the real world, it's not just two people speaking to each other. There are four or five people in a conversation, and people are interrupting each other, speaking at the same time, and this can be incredibly difficult for a new English speaker, especially if they don't have practice with listening to native speakers. Now, idioms and slang are really difficult because a lot of times a beginner student will be able to hear a couple words in a sentence and piece together the whole meaning of the sentence. However, especially with idioms, a lot of times a student will hear one or two words in the idiom and then try to piece together the sentence through those words. But as you know, an idiom is only effective if you hear the whole thing so you can understand what that idiom actually means. And then there's also the problem of if the student does not know the idiom, there's no way they can understand the conversation. So, for instance, if a group of colleagues are talking about the boss and someone says, "Let's not rock the boat," and the student only hears rock, boat, there's no way the student is going to be able to figure out what the meaning of that sentence is. So that's just to think about. Idioms and slang need to be taught, but it's not going to be that effective for the student until they really can understand everything that a speaker is saying. All right, last thing is speed. And if you have learned Spanish, you definitely know this. Spanish speakers speak really quickly, and it's incredibly difficult as a new beginner student to figure out what's being said. This is completely different from inside the classroom because with a beginner and even going into intermediate, the teacher is slowing down their speech pattern so that it's easier for the beginning student to figure out what is going on in the class. So this is what you're always working towards, especially with your advanced students, is native level of speaking. The speed needs to be there so that they're prepared to use the language outside of the classroom. So these are some keys to teaching listening. You want to keep it authentic. That means you're not taking some random clips from online. You want to try to get regular intonation patterns and provide a context for what the students are hearing. If the student doesn't know the context of the conversation, this is going to be incredibly difficult for them to understand what is happening in the conversation. Listening is not a test. This is huge. Listening is a skill that they are developing. So this does not mean that listening can't be on a test, but every time they listen, this should be something they're practicing. They should be able to listen to something a lot of times before they're actually tested on it. This is really important because, especially if it's a podcast or something that there is no actual speaker and they can't see the lips and the gestures of the speaker, you want to give them a couple times to practice because this is how that skill develops, and it's really the only way the skill is going to develop. Okay, now let's get into the main part of this, which is the listening lesson plan. The thing you always want to do with a lesson plan is engage. Get your students excited about what's going to happen. This is really important because listening is a really hard skill to develop. So you need to get a good engagement question to get your students excited. You also want to intro your objective, and you should always, always, always have your students read that objective and get them really understanding what the point of this lesson is going to be today. Now, this is a question for you. Which of these is true? Should the student first listen to the conversation and then learn the vocabulary and figure out what the focus question is? Or should the students learn the vocabulary and the focus question first and then listen to the conversation? So think about this, maybe pause the video and come back in a few seconds. All right, so the thing you want to do first is always teach them the vocabulary. This is different from a reading exercise or a speaking or any other lesson because you usually want them to see it in context first and then pick it out. But with a listening, it's very difficult for students to figure out the words they don't know. Or maybe they know a word, but they just hear it incorrectly. You want to give them as much help as you possibly can with preparing for this listening activity, so you want to introduce that vocab. The focus question is also important because it gives something for the students to listen for. You don't want them to just be listening for everything and trying to understand everything the first time around. You want them to be focused on a objective. So that focus question is really key. So pre-teach your vocabulary. After you've done your objective, you pre-teach the vocabulary that you know your students are going to need to learn. Once you have the vocabulary down pat, you want to make sure your students feel comfortable with the pronunciation because that is how they're going to identify this new vocabulary. So make sure this is really down pat. And then you're transitioning to your practice. The practice is the listening. So you first introduce the focus question. So this is a good example of a focus question. What are people in the conversation talking about? You could do what is a title for this conversation, something very broad, just what is going on in the conversation. And then you're going to want to transfer to your listening. Now you're going to do this at least 2 times and usually more. Unless your students are really capable and have a really good grasp of this listening activity, you're going to want to do it 3 or 4 times simply because the more they listen, the better at it they're going to get. Repetition is the best thing to do for listening because the only way to get better at it is to practice it. After you've answered this global question, you're going to go to a more detailed question. And that is something very specific in the listening the students need to listen for. And after that, you're listening to it again and maybe 2 or 3 times. If you have multiple detailed questions, you want to give maybe one, maximum two, have your students listen, and then go back and give them some more. You don't want to overwhelm them with too many because if they do, it's going to be really difficult to listen for multiple detailed questions within a single listening prompt. So keep it nice and easy, keep it straightforward, 1 or 2 detailed questions at a time. After that, you want to make sure you have some sort of activate because listening is difficult, it's a struggle, and you want to give your students something to really get them excited about the learning again. Because a lot of times students will be frustrated because listening is so difficult and not be as engaged with the lesson. So discussions are a great way to activate for higher levels only though, because this requires a great deal of speaking ability. You need to be able to articulate what you just listened to and be able to talk about it with your peers. If that is not an option, if you're teaching a beginner or early intermediate class, a writing or speaking task is a much better thing to do. You can have your students work in twos or threes so that they can have some interaction with each other about what they just learned about, but make sure you do this. Activating is the best part of the lesson most of the time for your students, so you want to make sure you give it to them because that's what they're excited about. Now, this is a quick summary of what a lesson should look like. You're engaged. You have the engagement question. You introduce your objective. Get them excited about what they're going to do, right? Because you got to make sure they're excited. Because if not, you're going to lose them. Practice. Teach the vocabulary. Assign the focus question. And that's the first one is your global question. You're basically what is this listening prompt all about? From there, you're going to listen to the conversation, speech, whatever it is, a couple of times. It's even better if you have a video of the conversation or the speech so that the students can look at the mouth. Another thing that you should also think about is exposing them to different accents. Even for myself, listening to a British accent or an Irish accent is difficult for me sometimes because I'm not accustomed to it. I grew up in Chicago, in Midwestern America, and the accent is just not there compared to one that is in England or Scotland, right? So make sure you're exposing them to different accents because a lot of times if they're taking a test, they're going to need to be accustomed to those accents. More practice. That is the detailed question, and you're listening more. Detailed questions, remember, something very specific that happens in the story. This makes your students really listen closely and understand every single word that's being said. Just because your students answer it the first time they listen to it doesn't mean they got it correct. Because a lot of times listening activities and conversations will have a no thrown in there really quickly, and that will reverse the whole meaning of the sentence. So make sure you're listening a couple times with your students so they can really listen for what is actually happening in those conversations. Finally, activate. Speak or write about what you're doing. Don't have them read something, don't have them listen more. Make sure you get out of the receptive skills, get out of the listening, and into a productive skill, which is speaking or writing, because that's more exciting for your students and they can interact more. Always remember that error correct and review. Your activate should have something to do with the listening activity, something with the vocab, something along those lines. And you should be correcting that at the end because that's a really important thing to do. All right, so these are some cool listening activities that I have done before. Transcribing a speech or a conversation. This is difficult, but it makes sure your students are really learning every single word and listening for every single word in a conversation. This is something you probably don't want to do with beginner students because it's going to be way too overwhelming for them. But for higher level students, it's a great way to get them really into the meticulous detail of listening. You should also think about not having a conversation that is too fast because if you do, it's just going to be impossible for your students to understand. A speech is a good thing because in a speech, the tone of voice is usually slower and there's more enunciation. So I would recommend that for this sort of activity. Taking charts. This is for lower levels. The students are just listening for how many times whoever is in the conversation says a word. So for instance, how many times does John say cool? And the students will just have to tick it off, and you have the right answer, and then if they get it wrong, they have to listen to it again and again and again. You can also have them write down the whole sentence of where John said cool for a more difficult and in-depth way of using this activity, especially with higher levels with intermediate. So listen to directions and draw a map. So this is cool because you give every student a map and you're having them try to get to the grocery store, maybe, but you're not telling them this. And you have instructions about how to walk to the grocery store, and then when they're done, they have to tell you where they ended up. And if a student got it right, they end up at the grocery store. They end up at the bank, that means they made a mistake, they need to listen to it again. This is really good for prepositions and directions. And then finally, creating a title. I talked about this before, but it's a really good thing for a global question. Students just need to listen to the whole conversation, figure out what the general idea is. This is also really helpful for reading activities, but it transfers well into a listening activity for the global question. To wrap things up, I just wanted to give you a couple things to remember while you're making your listening lesson plans. Listening is so difficult, and because of that, you need to make sure you're constantly using it. And the best way to do that is just to make sure English is the only language that's happening in your classroom. Do whatever you can not to revert back to the home language while you're doing this, because that 45 minutes or 1 hour of class time is sacred English time. Even for simple tasks like sharpening a pencil, going to the bathroom, saying that I don't understand something, these should be done in English with your students, and you should always answer them in English so they have that practice of hearing what English sounds like. This sounds kind of silly because a student knows what English sounds like, but no, you are the expert, you are the native speaker, and you have a good American, Canadian, English accent. So make sure you're using your accent as much as possible. And that is because you want to get them exposed to different accents. Whatever accent you have, you need to augment your teaching with different accents from different parts of the world. This is even true for accents that are not strictly English. So having someone from a country that is not a native speaker come and speak is a good thing to do because a student is going to have trouble understanding them. As a native speaker, it's easier for us because we know how people sometimes make mistakes with the pronunciation, but it's really difficult for a non-native speaker sometimes to understand another non-native speaker that has a strong accent. So this is a problem that you need to address because students who are perfectionists are going to be really frustrated with listening because starting out as a beginner and intermediate, when you hear a conversation, a lot of words are going to slip by you, especially the little prepositions or pronouns, things like this can be really difficult to understand. So it's not going to be a perfect art. You should support these perfectionist students as much as you can and show them that it's a process. This is not a goal to understand everything right away. That's not a reasonable goal. That goal is way back when you're going to be advanced. This is a long way away. But as an intermediate beginner student, you are just trying to get exposed to the English language as much as possible. Finally, you need to listen if you want to get better at listening. And this is just the most important part that you can take away from this. And give your students as much opportunity to do listening as they possibly can and encourage them to do it outside of the classroom. This doesn't mean you give them an MP3 that is some people talking about some random academic subject. This can be really easy, fun things like listening to music, watching movies, watching videos, and especially if they can find videos, maybe even on YouTube, that have subtitles in English, this can be really helpful for learning how to listen to for certain words. Music is really great because it's so difficult for a beginner to learn. The singers are usually not speaking with correct pronunciation, or they're drawing it out a little bit to make the whole rhythm and everything flow nicely. Now, this is great for native speakers because it sounds really nice, but for non native speakers, this can be really difficult. So, encourage them to look up lyrics for songs that are popular because English music is everywhere, and your students will be able to find this on the internet. I hope that you've learned some useful things in this lesson and that you can go forth and make some really cool listening lesson plans because they're so important, even though they are difficult and sometimes intimidating. So, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you back next time. Bye bye.